In 1964, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster was released and changed the face of the Godzilla series forever. Up until this point, Godzilla was a tragic villain, and this movie finally casts him as a hero. For this and for many other reasons, this is my second favorite monster movie of all time, and is easily one of the best in the entire series. In fact, this movie is so good that if you're a Godzilla movie fan and Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster is not at least in your top 5, then you are a liar.
The plot is magnificent in its simplicity. A giant meteor falls to Earth during a meteor shower, which eventually has to free the titular Ghidorah, who then goes on to try to destroy the world. Prophet eventually shows up to warn of the coming of Ghidorah, as well as the beginning of Godzilla and the return of Rodan. Rodan is a creature who previously starred as the titular monster in Toho's 1956 movie of the same name, and here appears for the first time in the Godzilla series. This Prophet turns out to be a princess and heiress to the throne of some made-up nation, I actually forgot what it is, and she's possessed by a Venusian consciousness, because Venus, and Mars in the American version, was the last planet Ghidorah destroyed. This is as silly as it sounds, but these are the kinds of things you don't question as a kid, and that as an adult you find endearing.
Shinichi Sekizawa writes the script for this film, and he does a fantastic job fleshing out characters who are both believable and lovably plucky. Special attention should be given to actress Yuriko Hoshi for her portrayal of the reporter Naoko Shindo, as she's really the first example of a strong female character in the Godzilla series. Naoko Shindo is a competent and intelligent woman who ends up scooping her male colleagues and getting the Ghidorah story directly from the prophetess. Examples of forward thinking like this are real identifiers of writer Sekizawa's more upbeat work, and it's a breath of fresh air to have such a strong female lead, especially in a sci-fi genre full of damsels in distress. Godzilla and Rodan awaken and start fighting, and eventually Mothra shows up to plead with them to team up and fight Ghidorah. The result is a spectacular 4-way giant monster battle royale. For much of the Godzilla fanbase, though, this movie holds an odd position, with many fans applauding the special effects and the design of the iconic villain of the Godzilla universe in the titular three-headed monster, while simultaneously dispraising the film for its comedic camp and the massive chronological differences between the American and Japanese versions of the film. A lot of fans view this film as a point where the Godzilla series started going downhill, culminating in the end of the original series in 1975. This view is simply untrue. Many of the Godzilla fans are scared to admit that we really got into giant monster movies as kids, engrossed by the fighting and the comedy. This backlash against the camp comedy prevalent in Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster is a natural reaction of the adult fan trying to rationalize a love of a genre about big monsters wrecking everything up. In 1964, as today, children were the biggest audience for Godzilla films, and this disdain of camp comedy is foolish, especially considering the box office shattering success of King Kong vs. Godzilla, which is clearly a comedy film itself. This movie is honestly one of the only instances in the series where I play the part of the English dubbing apologist. Among Godzilla fans, there is this pervading snobbishness towards the dubbed Americanized versions of sci-fi classics, but I would like to point out that it is ridiculous to limit the accessibility of Godzilla movies in any way that would deny children. This means recognizing worthy language dubs, such as the original Americanization of Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. The American version of the film is actually quite different than the Japanese version, with many of the scenes of the film appearing in a different chronological order between the two. Naturally, fans tend to overreact to this and pass off the dub as bad just because it's not the original, but I would actually argue that the Americanization of Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster is the superior of the two cuts, noting that this will alienate me from much of my intended audience. Many of the differences between the Japanese and American releases of the film can fall into one of two categories: to either make the Godzilla character more sympathetic for audiences, or to speed up the arrival of Ghidorah on screen. Despite the fact that Godzilla is a hero, the Japanese cut actually has him start the film as a straight-up bad guy. In the Japanese version, Godzilla wakes up and decides that it's time to start killing things, and then he starts killing things. For the American version, however, these scenes were intercut with shots of Rodan flying overhead. Because of this and a few clever scene rearrangements, it's made to come across that Rodan woke Godzilla up, and Godzilla's destruction is accidental as he just wants to fight Rodan. This change makes a lot more sense given that Godzilla is supposed to be a hero in this film. Since Godzilla's destruction is just due to clumsiness since he wants to beat up that jerk that woke him up, the Americanization is the cut which is more story consistent. As previously noted, the American version of the film brings Ghidorah into the movie a lot earlier than the Japanese version. Significant changes include moving the scene where Ghidorah's meteor crashes to Earth to the very beginning of the film rather than delaying it as in the Japanese version, and having Ghidorah hatch from said meteorite a day earlier in the context of the story. As a matter of fact, Ghidorah appears about a day and a half sooner in the American version than he does in the Japanese version. The result of this change is that Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster is an action-packed spectacle movie with a juicy story, and San Daikaiju Shikyu Saidai no Kessen is an expositional slog at times. Plus, I'd have to ask, why would you save the title character for the very end of the film? Interestingly, and possibly for the only time in the Godzilla series, it's the Japanese version with the continuity error for this scene. In San Daikaiju, Godzilla first encounters Rodan at night after destroying the city, then fights him in the daytime. Ghidorah appears at night and is prophesized by the possessed princess in the daytime, which makes the Rodan-Godzilla battle a 2.5-day ordeal since they start fighting at night and continue through the next day. Ghidorah wakes up that night and then invades immediately in the morning, and Godzilla and Rodan are still fighting. The American version is superior as it allows Ghidorah to show up as early as possible and shortens the film in a way that makes it both more gripping and more streamlined. Godzilla encounters Rodan. Ghidorah wakes up, Godzilla and Rodan fight through the morning, Ghidorah invades Japan in the afternoon. This change does, however, bring up the interesting question of what Ghidorah actually does after he hatches in the American version, since he doesn't start destroying things until nearly a full day later. One final thing fans typically point to when they argue that this film is too silly is the memorable giant monster conversation between Mothra, Godzilla, and Rodan, and translated for the human main characters by the Mothra fairies. My response is this. Of course this scene is silly. The movie's a comedy. Instead of worrying about things like this,
they've always had trouble with men, and men hate them. And Rodan says, yes, he's right.
you should be laughing at things like this.
Ooh, Godzilla, what terrible language.
I love this film. Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster is a fantastically gripping giant monster comedy which succeeds across the board. It checks every box and dots every I. And despite the false supposition that this movie led to the downfall of the original series, Ghidorah was a massive success in theaters and brought many current Godzilla fans to the series for the first time. The fact is that before 1964, Godzilla was a monster with an uncertain future, and after 1964 he was cemented as an immediately recognizable pop culture phenomenon. Plus it has my favorite monster in it, so there's always that.
Special request, the Twin Fairies from Martha's Island.